Did Donald Trump just declare war on Chicago? Oh boy. We're going to cover this and more on the weekend edition of Cat Watch Update.
President Trump dramatically escalated his rhetoric Saturday by declaring a metaphorical war through a Truth Social post featuring AI-generated Apocalypse Now style image. The post portrays Trump as a military commander over the Chicago skyline with helicopters and Chicagolypse Now. This references his renamed Department of War, which is ironic since he dodged the draft several times. He has threatened to deploy National Guard and the Marines to support ICE strike teams several times over the past few weeks. We initially kicked off the weekend with a rating of 75, which belongs solidly in the high-risk zone, but Trump's Truth Social post increased the overall risk to 78 and also has impacted at least 3 of the 11 areas, pushed them into the critical zone. I'll break it down for you, but first, here's how the Authoritarian Risk Scale was developed.
I thought it would be helpful to review the scaling system that ChatGPT and I created. This scale assesses democratic norms, institutional functioning and civil liberties against events that have taken place over the week. I check the Authoritarian Risk weekly since each day brings updates from all 3 branches of government and of course bully man baby Donald Trump's intimidation tactics through his Truth Social.
Executive power overreach is at a critical 90 out of 100. This week, 2 developments could push it further. The Supreme Court will hear arguments on whether the president can use emergency powers to impose tariffs. And there are fresh threats of deploying federal forces to New Orleans, Louisiana. Checks and balances sit at 42 out of 100, which are weakened as Congress struggles with a looming September 30th government shutdown and partisan gridlock. The current severity is rated at moderate and has been trending as weakening. Some events to watch this week are the Supreme Court case on tariff powers, potential deployment of federal forces to New Orleans, progress against the government shutdown that will be happening on September 30th. Protest rights are at 90 out of 100 and civil liberties are at 88 out of 100, both in critical territory. Surveillance remains at 70, which is elevated and worsening. This week, demonstrations are expected to continue in Washington, D.C. following National Guard deployment and the forcible removal of a long-standing protest encampment near the White House. These events show how civic space is being closed off. Events to watch this week are ongoing protests against federal troop deployments, political violence and extremism, along with law enforcement militarization, are both at 90 out of 100, which is critical. Trump's war on Chicago rhetoric and calls to deploy Guard units elsewhere risk normalizing domestic conflict. This week, more statements are expected framing U.S. cities as internal enemies, amplifying the risk of escalation. This week was the Pentagon was rebranded as the Department of War, which was reported by The Guardian. Also this week, there were threats from Donald Trump to deploy federal troops, which was reported by Associated Press. Press freedom is at 60 out of 100, which is elevated. Harassment of journalists continues to erode open reporting, and the restriction of other news media outlets that will ask hard-hitting questions as opposed to softballs of our president are largely excluded from asking questions or even being present in the press room. The control of journalism and legacy media are continued to be driven by corporate interest rather than actual important news. And Donald Trump's intimidation tactic on Truth Social received little coverage, and ongoing threats from the president are sadly normalized. Reported that the annual Mexican Independence Day weekend celebration called El Grito was canceled due to President bully man baby's tantrum and wishful thinking on his Truth Social. Judicial independence holds at 67, which is elevated, but its future hinges on the Supreme Court. This week, justices will weigh whether to curb or expand presidential control of agencies and emergency powers. There was also a anonymous reporting from ABC News in which lower court judges were calling into account the Supreme Court for not providing guidance and creating rulings from the shadow docket without any further explanation, calling into question the breakdown of constitutional integrity. Amy Cohen Barrett, one of our Supreme Court justices, who is a conservative Catholic, has reported that these threats to constitutional integrity are over dramatized, and that the rule of law is very well and present in the United States, which brings into doubt Justice Cohen's grip on reality, given all of the things that President Trump and his executive overreach within his cabinet. State resistance is at 55, which is also elevated. However, governors and mayors opposing federal incursions are keeping this on the lower side. Election integrity is 63, which is elevated but stable. It continues to be vulnerable to interference campaigns, voting machines, and President Trump's persistence on eliminating mail-in ballots. However, this has been largely maintained through the states that this was a state decision and not up to the executive branch. This week, attention turns to National Voter Registration Day, which is going to be on September 16th, both testing how resilient local election systems remain. So definitely on the 16th, make sure that you are registering to vote and are checking your voter registration. So we'll see how the state, especially the state of Illinois, continues to push back against the federal troops and immigration actions. This week's flashpoints could move the Authoritarian Risk Scale upward again. The first is a Supreme Court ruling on emergency economic powers. We hope that these tariffs will continue to be voted against as illegal to prevent President Trump from further damaging the economy. We are also looking ahead to further federal troop threats towards major U.S. cities. And following protests in Washington, D.C., and throughout the streets of Chicago, there will be intensifying protests and crackdowns. We look ahead to a government shutdown showdown at the end of the month. I highly doubt that we are going to have any sort of balanced budget when our current president is spending money like water and hoping to be bailed out by the Fed. Lastly, the opening of election season with National Voter Registration Day should bring hope to the American people and empower all of us in the urgency and importance of voting to create changes within our government. Our votes are desperately needed to make these changes, especially from people who are younger and from folks who've never voted before. the power of your vote is so important and significant that even President Donald Trump does not want you to vote. And we should take that as a sign of rebellion to do exactly the opposite of what he wants us to do, which is to vote. So keep your heads up and keep registering and check your registration, of course. So all of these events that I just referenced have potential to reshape the balance between democracy and authoritarianism. We should also be hearing from other appeals that the Trump administration is calling that should be hitting the Supreme Court. I really do hope that the Supreme Court is able to recognize their importance of the rule of law and not to continue furthering these constitutional crises that we are currently in. Press freedom is at 60 out of 100, which is elevated. Harassment of journalists continues to erode open reporting, and the restriction of other news media outlets that will ask hard-hitting questions as opposed to softballs of our president are largely excluded from asking questions and or even being present in the press room. The control of journalism and legacy media are continued to be driven by corporate interest rather than actual important news. Donald Trump's intimidation tactic on Truth Social received little coverage, and ongoing threats that are coming from the president are sadly normalized. Local news in Chicago reported that the annual Mexican Independence Day weekend celebration called El Grito was canceled due to President bully man baby's tantrum and wishful thinking on his Truth Social. Judicial independence holds at 67, which is elevated, but its future hinges on the Supreme Court. This week, justices will weigh whether to curb or expand presidential control of agencies and emergency powers. There was also a anonymous reporting from ABC News in which lower court judges were calling into account the Supreme Court for not providing guidance and or creating rulings from the shadow docket without further explanation, calling into question the breakdown of constitutional integrity. However, Amy Coney Barrett, who is one of our Supreme Court justices, who is a conservative Catholic, has reported that these threats to constitutional integrity are largely dramatized and that the rule of law is very well present in the United States, which brings into doubt Justice Cohen's grip on reality, given all of the things that President Trump and his executive overreach within his cabinet members and beyond. It's just frustrating. In July, the overall score was 72 out of 100, which is firmly in the high zone. July saw surveillance expansions and aggressive executive actions beginning to pile up. In August, the score spiked to 78, which was the sharpest monthly rise. The trigger was federal troop deployment orders and a shakeup of the Department of Justice that undercut institutional independence. So far in September, the score dipped slightly to 75, starting the weekend after courts pushed back against some of the executive moves. But now, following the president's declaration of war on Chicago, the score has jumped back to 78 again, brushing the line of critical. What stands out is how quickly flashpoints escalate risk. Court wins and state resistance only provide brief relief, while new executive actions and militarized rhetoric rapidly drive the meter upward. My hope for the moment is that we will all continue to be aware of the upcoming changes There's a really good video that I will put on my playlist on the economy, and it's giving us a really good broad view of the economy. For those of us who have been noticing the changes in buying groceries, with our groceries becoming more and more expensive, being able to buy less and less, one of the things that stood out from the video was that Americans more and more are deciding to skip meals, which is allowing for the offset of groceries being expensive. And so this is something that is keeping the amount spent on groceries each week relatively stable. But once again, when you're now to the point of skipping meals, we know that this is a really significant time in history in which we're heading into a recession or stagnation, which is considered very dangerous. This video also talks about how the mass deportations of immigrants is really being reflected in the current job numbers. And something that was rang true for me was that even though I was laid off as of August 15th, I was still receiving paychecks for half of my time as a severance, which keeps me on as an employee part time with the organization. Reducing hours for full time employees is one of the behaviors we'll see from employers who are reaching the point of having to do mass layoffs. We will see an increased number of job layoffs and the decrease in people who are actively looking for jobs, because those job numbers don't include people who have stopped looking for jobs because they've become frustrated and disenfranchised. It's also noted that many of the jobs that are available are hiring people part time. And many of these low paying jobs are not supporting people in being able to pay their bills and to pay for what's needed in order to maintain housing and to live. We're all living paycheck to paycheck within inches away from being unhoused and experiencing food scarcity. So again, we keep our hopes up and looking forward to the registration of voters for this upcoming election. I believe in November, Californians will be voting on whether or not to create these districts in increased number of districts within California. This is something to keep in mind, especially if you are in Kern County, currently being mismanaged by David Valadao, a Republican who voted for the big ugly bill. There are at least 3 representatives in California districts who are Republicans, all of which voted for the big ugly bill and who are largely silent in having town halls and any sort of explanation for their lack of care and their voting for the president man baby. If we're hearing information about other political hopefuls wanting to replace any of these Republican representatives, it's really helpful to give them a shout out and start spreading the word so that we can get these folks out of office. The other part of this is to challenge us all, asking significant questions about what someone's plan is for representing us as a people and as a district. Are they going to be more of the same with false promises without any realistic plan on how to make those changes? Or are they coming with plans, details, and information that makes sense to us all? We need people who are going to be our representatives, who are going to stand tall and be brave in the face of some really horrible executive overreach. We need people in office to really step up and represent the people, because we need to be able to trust and put hope in them to make the changes that are needed and to really fight back against this authoritarian regime, also known as President Trump. So with that, I will leave you on a happy note. In light of President Trump being a bully, it reminds me of a toddler or a young person, maybe probably, but I don't want to insult children in this aspect of it. But President Man Baby, who's a bully, I really am looking forward to, in my mind, I visualize President Man Baby having his electronics stripped from him and being put into a corner until he is expected to act right again. That's something I hope for in the future. I keep this little dream in my head that President Bully Man will be held to account and will be someday in hopefully the near future will be put in the corner and finally stripped of his electronics, or so that we as an American people do not have to be tormented by his bullying on a day-to-day and sometimes moment-to-moment intimidation tactics and bullying. With that, I will turn it back over to you, and we'll see you next time. If you like this video, please hit like and drop me a comment. Also, please support my work by subscribing to my channel and sharing this video.